While the global transport of people is dominated by the aviation industry, about 80% of all manufactured goods and raw materials worldwide travel by sea. As of 2024, there are about 120,000 merchant vessels traversing the oceans alongside some 2,700 military vessels and more than 300 large cruise ships. These Leviathans are built with a large lifespan in mind, averaging between 25 and 30 years. But after a glorious life in service, they too must be retired. Mothballing, especially for military ships, might be an option. Sometimes vessels are just scuttled or left to sink to the depths of the oceans. But the most frequent, cost-effective, and theoretically sustainable method is to sail these sea monsters to a shipbreaking yard where they are dismantled and their individual components are recycled. Up to 40% of all retired ships are sent to one unassuming coastal village in the state of Gujarat in India. This is where ships are sent to die. Now, unfortunately, this is also the location where far too many laborers lose their lives to accidents and illnesses related to poor health and safety. And yet, concerted action from the authorities and private companies was able to overturn the reputation of what was once one of the most lethal workplaces on Earth. This is Alang, also known as the shipbreaking capital of the world. Alright, let's begin by clarifying what a shipbreaking yard is. In very simple terms, it's a specialized facility where vessels are broken down to their last, smallest components. The furnishings and equipment might be recuperated, but the big bucks are made from stripping the hulls of all metal components, chiefly steel, for them to be sold into recycling. As a business, shipbreaking is subject to boom and bust cycles, which follow opposite patterns to the ones of the global economy. To clarify, in periods of economic growth, shipping companies are very busy transporting goods and materials around the world and therefore are less likely to retire their units. But during recessions, the same companies may scrap their older vessels, providing a bit of a bonanza for shipbreakers. Alright, let's talk about building your online presence, because let's face it, trying to make a website without the right tools is like trying to build a house with no blueprint. You are going to get somewhere, but it's going to be a bit rubbish, isn't it? Enter Squarespace, your all-in-one platform for creating a stunning website, managing your business, and even selling products or content all in one place. Whether you're a beginner or a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to design a website that fits your unique needs. Here's what's really cool. Squarespace Design Intelligence uses AI and over 2 decades of design expertise to help you build a website that's not only beautiful, but also personalized. It's like having your own creative assistant, ensuring your site looks like it belongs on the front page of the internet. For those who want to make transactions as smooth as possible, Squarespace Payments is there. You can manage all your payments in one place, whether you're accepting Apple Pay, Klarna, or even ACH Direct Debit. It's quick, it's simple, it ensures your customers can pay how they want to pay. Plus, if you're looking to build and sell an online course, Squarespace's Courses feature has you covered. You can easily create engaging lessons, upload videos, and even add a paywall so you can monetize your knowledge, whether you're charging a one-time fee or offering subscriptions. So if you're ready to build your site or take it to the next level, head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/megaprojects and save 10% on your first purchase of a website or a domain. Big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get back to it. Before 1983, the vast majority of shipbreaking companies and their scrapyards were located in the UK, Taiwan, Mexico, Brazil, and Spain. But by the end of the decade, a shift was already in motion, with the industry drifting towards Turkey, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. There are several practical reasons for the shift of industry towards these regions. The climate is generally temperate, allowing for shipbreaking to take place throughout the year. These countries' coastlines display the ideal combination of high tides and large sandy beaches, which make it easy to transport large ships on dry land. Finally, the domestic markets have a high demand for scrap steel. There are also some economic considerations at play here. After the mid-1980s, the cost of breaking ships in the original locations rose sharply, especially in the UK, Spain, and Taiwan. This rise was due in part to higher labor costs, but mainly due to increased regulations designed to address environmental concerns. Eventually, the costs involved in the activity exceeded the revenue which may be obtained from scrap metal. This was not the case in the recycling yards located in Asia, though. Not only would labor be cheaper, but the countries involved had less stringent health, safety, and environmental regulations. The consequence was that the ship-breaking countries such as India, Bangladesh, or the Philippines would be beset with high volumes of toxic waste arriving from tearing apart huge vessels. Alas, this was a price that the industrialized West was willing to pay. As early as 1991, World Bank chief economist Lawrence Summers wrote in a memo, "I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. The measurements of the costs of health-impairing pollution depend on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality. From this point of view, a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages." Alang is a coastal village about 50 kilometers south of Bhavganar in western India, overlooking the Gulf of Khambhat. A stretch of 12 kilometers of shoreline extending northwards from Alang to Sasiya is home to a total of 120 shipbreaking yards. These were first established in 1982, and even if privately operated, their activities are supervised by a government agency, the Gujarat Maritime Board, or GMB. Alang inaugurated its operations in February 1983, when the ship MV Kota Tenjong was beached in one of its yards and promptly taken apart. During their first 10 years in business, the Alang yard scrapped an average of over 100 ships each year. By the early 2000s, shipbreakers were able to break and recycle 300 vessels per year. By the late 2000s, Alang could easily carve out more than 400 sea monsters per year. As mentioned earlier, the industry is subject to ebbs and flows, and from 2012 to 2021, the average annual number of scrap ships fell to a still impressive 245. All in all, the Alang yards under GMB have taken apart, dissected, and recycled a total of 8,524 ships up to 2021. That's an average of 0.83 vessels taken apart every single day. And mind you, we're not talking about just any small fishing boat here. The Alang yards can take on leviathans measuring up to 50,000 light displacement tonnage, or LDT. To clarify, this is a unit of measurement that indicates the weight of the ship excluding cargo, fuel, passengers, and crew. A ship with such an LDT will usually measure up to 200 meters in length, or 2 American football fields. Such an intense level of activity can produce up to 4.5 million metric tons of scrap metal every year, mainly steel. This is a mass equivalent to 13.5 times that of the Empire State Building. More importantly, the recycled metal can generate a turnover in excess of 70 billion rupees, or about $935 million. These results can only be achieved thanks to a huge workforce. According to official estimates, each of the 120 Alang yards employ between 150 and 200 people. These estimates, however, may not take into account the thousands of seasonal migrant workers who flock to the Gujarati coastline from nearby. A more realistic number is close to 100,000 laborers, mostly young, male, and illiterate, who are either employed directly by the yards or involved in the adjacent recycling industry. Most of these laborers perform highly specialized tasks, such as operating winches and cranes, cutting apart large sheets of steel, or handling asbestos. They work long hours, and as we'll learn later, they're exposed to extreme occupational hazards. And yet, the average wages at Alang are around 650 rupees per day. Even working 30 days a month, that would equate to a salary of 19,500 rupees, a measly $231. Now, the business of breaking down ships begins thousands of nautical miles away from Alang, usually in Dubai, Hamburg, London, or Singapore. These are where most shipbrokers are based, professionals in charge of mediating between ship owners and cargo owners, who also take charge of retiring old ships. In the latter case, the brokers will mediate between ship owners and ship breakers, who will pay anywhere from $500 to $700 per ton for the vessels. The breakers will then sail the ship just off the coast of Alang, where it will be anchored. Local authorities will then conduct a safety inspection of the ship. In particular, they'll ensure that the hull is not at risk of exploding due to fuel leaks or accumulated gas. If everything is in order, the skippers hired by the breakers will wait for high tide, which at Alang can rise up to 11 meters. Then they'll launch the ship at full speed toward the shore so that it runs aground. Once the ship is beached, teams of workers will gather around it and secure it with chains and cables. The risk of explosions due to accumulated gases is still a concern though, and thus the braking teams will punch large holes into the hull to vent flammable materials. The process will also allow seawater to seep into the hull and wash out the fuel tanks. Next, the vessel will be stripped of all equipment, furnishings, appliances, anything from the lifeboats to the toilets and insulating material. These items will be sold just outside the yard, either directly by the laborers or by specialized resellers. The third step in the process is the proper shipbreaking. Workers will wield drills, gas torches, even cranes to cut apart large sections of the ship. They'll first attack the ship's bow and gradually proceed toward the stern, stripping out huge chunks of steel. As the vessel sheds its weight, the surviving lighter carcass of the sea monster will be dragged further and further inland by tractors and bulldozers. Eventually, what was once a mighty merchant ship will be reduced to a collection of large metal components. These will be dragged away from the shore by giant winches, cut into smaller pieces, and then taken by truck to a specialized steel mill. The steel, thus salvaged from the ships, will then be recycled, often in the form of reinforcement rods, and reused in the construction of roads and buildings. For most of their time in operation, the Alang shipbreaking yards were plagued by poor occupational health and a hazardous work environment, leading to frequent injury, illness, and death amongst its workers. From 1983 to 2008, a total of 398 laborers lost their lives in accidents or work-related injuries. That's an average of 15.3 deaths per year. From 2009 to 2018, a further 127 individuals died while working in the yard. The death rate had decreased to 12.7 deaths per year, which is still 1 death a month, a toll far too high to be tolerated in any occupation. According to analysis by Jitanjoy Sahu from the Institute of Social and Economic Change in Bangalore, quote, "Workers' health and safety concerns are not paid adequate attention by the companies and concerned authorities." The report pointed out how laborers were not provided with basic safety equipment such as face masks, boiler suits, gloves, and heavy-duty boots. And even when available, quote, "They are of poor quality and inadequate, and sometimes only provided at the time of inspection." Moreover, shipbreakers could not afford proper accommodation and had to live in improvised dwellings in and around the beaches of Alang, which lacked basic services such as drinking water, sanitation, and electricity. Needless to say, the tens of thousands of laborers living in these conditions had no access to education and almost no access to healthcare. Injured and ill shipbreakers could in fact rely only on 2 small hospitals, one operated by the Red Cross, the other private, and both lacking sufficient staff to support the laborer population. What's worse, the few doctors available were not specialized in skin and respiratory ailments, the most common conditions affecting workers who deal with hazardous chemicals. And this is a major concern, as shipbreakers were and are routinely exposed to toxic materials polluting the soil, water, and air around them, to say nothing of the accidents such as snapping cables, chemical spills, falls, falling objects, fires, and explosions. A 2015 study conducted in Taiwan reviewed health data for 4,427 shipbreakers collected from 1985 to 2008. To clarify, this study was not limited to the workforce in Alang, but it helps illustrate the general risks to which these laborers are exposed to. The Taiwan study found that out of those 4,427 individuals, a total of 1,376, or 30%, had contracted cancer, particularly of the esophagus, liver, trachea, and lungs. And of those 1,376, a staggering 940 had succumbed to the disease. We don't have specific prevalence and incidence rates for all cancer types for Alang, but thanks to a 2005 report by Greenpeace and the International Federation for Human Rights, we know that back then, quote, 1 in every 6 workers may have asbestosis, and workers are at inflated risk of lung and related forms of cancer. A Red Cross doctor working in Alang was reported as stating that, quote, 1 working day in the shipbreaking yards is equal to smoking 10 to 15 packs of cigarettes. The effects of poor occupational health conditions were not limited to workers only, but had disastrous consequences for their families too. The same 2005 report recounted the tragedy of an injured worker, whom we'll simply identify as R. Quoting him, "I was working on the deck of a ship beached at plot number 49. Somebody dropped a large iron ball, which struck my head. I fell unconscious and was brought to the hospital, but I don't know how long I stayed there, maybe 2 or 3 months. I wasn't aware of my condition, but gradually I found out that my left arm was fully paralyzed. After the incident, they paid me 3,000 rupees, that's $69, plus some money for medical treatment. I knew that the money given to me was meager, but I couldn't do anything. Now I am forced to beg." Mr. R eventually found another job washing dishes, but the years of hardship enacted an extreme toll on his family. His wife suffered from mental health issues, while 6 of their children died due to various diseases for which he could not afford treatment. Quoting again, "Quite often, I remember my lost children, and this brings tears to my eyes. But what can I do? I always curse the time I was forced to go to Alang." Up to 2006, the Alang shipbreakers had no chance to improve their working standards as they lacked trade union representation. This issue was partially addressed in that year with the foundation of the Alang Ship Recycling and General Workers Association. But in practice, there was little that the association could do, as most workers were fearful of joining union activities and demands. One of the workers, whose name we'd rather not share, in 2014 declared, "We are scared to protest against plot owners or to inform government officers about the working conditions and inadequate living facilities. If we protest, we lose our jobs." In addition to reporting the state of occupational health, Greenpeace also reviewed the environmental impact of the Alang shipbreaking yards in 2000 and 2005, with their findings being confirmed by a World Bank analysis in 2010. Up to 95% of the bulk of scrap ships at Alang consists of steel, most of which can be recycled, and that's fantastic, but the remaining 5% is made up of toxic materials such as oil sludge, asbestos, fuel residues, heavy metals, dioxins, and even radioactive substances. As mentioned earlier, these pollutants directly impact the laborers and local population, but also affect the environment in the long term. Quoting them, "Environmental damage includes soil contamination, soil erosion, water pollution, contamination of coastal regions, and subsequent biodiversity loss, such as the destruction of vast areas of mangroves, air pollution, and threats to plant and animal health." The impact of these factors is made worse by the fact that the yards at Alang do not employ containment structures such as dry docks. Vessels to be broken are simply anchored near the shore and then dragged onto the sand, where they remain for days or weeks until they are completely disassembled. As described by Greenpeace, during this period, that 5% of lethal substances will waft into the air, spill onto the sand, and drip into the water. In the late 2000s, India's Supreme Court took serious notice of the hellish conditions at Alang and formed a committee to study shipbreaking and recycling in all their aspects. As a result, the court's committee issued a set of guidelines on sustainable ship recycling to be enacted by the Gujarati Maritime Board and the Gujarat State Pollution Control Board. These organizations would be expected to perform inspections of the ships to be retired while still at anchor off the Alang beach. Whenever possible, both boards would be required to decontaminate the vessels of any hazardous materials. At the minimum, they would compile an inventory of all possible contaminants on board. Moreover, the Maritime Board was directed by the Supreme Court to strictly comply with a set of regulations titled Prevention of Fire and Accidents for Safety and Welfare of Workers and Protection of Environment During Shipbreaking Activities. It was approved as early as the year 2000, but it was seldom enforced. The practices put in place in Alang and other Asian shipbreaking yards also came under the scrutiny of the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. In 2009, the IMO convened the Hong Kong International Convention for Safe and Environmentally Sound Recycling of Ships. All of these things are enormous mouthfuls, which produced a set of standards to be applied and enforced by signatory nations. India was amongst them, but the Indian Parliament ratified the convention standards into law only in 2019. The good news is that most shipbreaking companies operating at Alang had decided to voluntarily comply with the convention since the early 2010s. One of the early pioneers of compliance was the Leela Group of companies. Its chief managing director, Kamal Kant Sharma, in 2021 declared that, quote, "Today, out of the 120 operational yards here, 92 have complied with Hong Kong certifications, including multiple ISO certifications from global agencies like Class, NK, R-Class, Lloyd's Register, Bureau Veritas, and RENA." End quote. Initially, Leela and other companies had introduced small changes to improve the health and safety of their workforce, such as providing basic personal protection equipment. Then they invested more time and resources into providing proper safety training to their laborers. Next, these companies invested into heavy machinery, such as heavy lift cranes, to reduce the risks associated with the manual handling of large metal scraps. Finally, the largest companies addressed the environmental concerns by developing dry docks with concrete flooring and drainage systems to prevent the contamination of land and water. As described by Leela's director of ship recycling, Vishal Raj Soni, quote, "Yards are concretized with 8-layered impermeable flooring and are reinforced with 1-inch thick steel to ensure complete protection from seepage into the land below." The Gujarati Maritime Board, GMB, has also contributed to the development of Alang by partnering with the Ship Recycling Industries Association and developing shared infrastructure. By the early 2020s, the partnership had built a third hospital, constructed better housing to accommodate 1,800 laborers, and developed a management and disposal facility for hazardous hazardous waste. The positive impacts of the Hong Kong Convention standards and the GMB upgrades was immediate. According to Indian publication Business Today, only 3 labourers lost their lives at Alang from 2019 to 2021. Now, it's 3 deaths too many, but it is a massive improvement compared to an average of 1 death per month in the previous decade. Business Today also stressed how Alang had performed giant leaps forward to address its pollution problem, completely overturning its previous reputation as a hellscape marked by contamination. Quote, Alang now has a new reputation. It is the greatest and safest shipbreaking hub, dismantling 30 to 35% of ships recycled a year globally. Unlike in the Western shipbreaking yards where everything goes as scrap, Alang helps to reuse almost 80% of a ship, from furniture, chairs, and kitchen cabinets to electrical motors, thereby reducing the global carbon footprint. It appears that investing in environmental safety was also a sound business decision, as Alang's new green credentials may make for a unique selling point against competitor shipbreaking yards. According to Anand Harmath, head of R&D at Shipbrokers Global Marketing Systems, quote, at least 15 of the world's leading ship owners have committed to recycle their ships only at green yards, and that is going to be a big business boost for Alang. So, the overall situation and working conditions at Alang seem to be on the up, at least according to the managers of shipbreaking companies, that is. Independent observers agree that great improvements have been made, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done. One of them is environmental NGO Robin des Bois, which is French for Robin Hood, by the way. According to them, quote, national regulations have been introduced to regulate the practice and limit the risks to the environment and workers, but their application remains questionable given the authorities' lack of monitoring capacity and the economic power wielded by the yards. Nicola Molinaris, Senior Communications and Policy Advisor at NGO Shipbreaking Platform, acknowledged the recent improvements, but pointed out that 3 hospitals are still insufficient to meet the needs of the labourers. Moreover, some of the shipbreaking yards are yet to implement the construction of dry docks and layered flooring, quoting, without containment, the various pollutants in the ships, their equipment, or their structures spill out onto the sand and in the water. You can improve as much as you want, but a beach will always remain a beach, and these yards, even the best in India, would never be allowed to operate in France or in Europe. Molinaris is overall critical of the standards set by the Hong Kong Convention as, quote, it was created by the International Maritime Organization, which is completely driven by the industry's interests. So the shipping industry can issue its own rules, its own laws. While huge progress has been made to adhere to international environmental and safety standards, the future of shipbreaking is ultimately uncertain. At the time of preparing this episode, another factor has added to this uncertainty, a recent plunge in the rate of activities and overall revenue. This sudden downturn is the result of a cheap influx of steel imports from China and Vietnam, as well as an upturn in the global freight market. Hence, there are fewer ships entering retirement and less demand for recycled steel. As of late 2024, only 24 out of the 120 recycling yards are currently in operation. Throughout the year, these yards have recycled 125 ships, the lowest data points of the past 2 decades. And shipbreakers expect business to shrink even further, with only 50 or 60 ships expected for scrapping in 2025. Mukesh Patel, chairman of large shipbreaker business Sri Ram Group, has gone so far as to declare 80% of Alang is dead. As we've learned earlier, this industry is subject to periodic boom and bust, following opposite patterns compared to the global economy. The Alang yards may return from the metaphorical dead. All we can hope is that they won't lose their positive momentum towards improving the welfare of their labourers, their families, and the environment as a whole. Thank you for watching.